This program is presented by the Fromm Institute for Lifelong Learning at the University of San Francisco. The Fromm Institute, keeping up with the times, no matter when.
Some of you have written me about theater you've been seeing, or I've bumped into you at the theater, and we've talked about how thinking about staging, design, casting, production actually seems to help animate your experiences at the theater. So for that, I'm really happy. Keep going, keep looking. I wish I could send you to a Pinter production in the next month, but alas, I don't think anything's happening right now in the Bay Area, but you never know. Anyway, today we're going to work on the play that I think is really Pinter's masterpiece. I did it at ACT in 2010, 2010-11 season. So some of you may remember that production with our core company. I know it's quite a controversial play, and I have a lot of things I want to say about it. And I'm sure in reading it, some of you thought, what is this strange and difficult play? And what does it mean? And what are we to make of Ruth? And what are we to make of Act Two, and et cetera? So hopefully we'll get to that. And anything you want to ask, as always, throw it in there and I will answer it. I will say that some of you asked last time, again, could you see it on video? And so I steered you to the 1973 film that Peter Hall made, which was from the original production. I still think every time I steer you to this and then I watch those films, I slightly cringe because I really don't think Pinter works on film. And I will sort of talk you through why I think that when we talk about how the plays work on stage. But everything that makes them visceral and like a pressure cooker and contained and linguistically dexterous and full of dangerous pauses and all of that kind of thing on stage sort of make them slightly inchoate and diffuse on film. In The Homecoming, the minute you can see Ruth walk out the door and you see her going down the street and then you see her walking back down the street and walking in, the pressure valve that is that room is released. And I think that Pinter really only works when the pressure valve is never released, and you never get to, the audience never gets to leave the picture frame of that room until the moment when something explodes and has to happen. Because you will remember, I hope, in my very first lecture that I talked about the rules of play in Pinter and some of the things that you learn about, for example, the way he created a world of predator and prey. So there's never a neutral statement made, even in The Homecoming, when Aston asks Mick, where do you come from? Asked Davies, where do you come from? Davies says, what do you mean? He's already defensive. He's already scared. He's already making the next move, because every question is a way of attacking the person you're across from in that binary way, because if you don't attack, you're going to get attacked, right? And so the other rule of play, and you really see this in The Homecoming, is that you mask your vulnerability, because if you reveal it, you will be decimated. Now, all of us come from families. All of us know exactly where the buttons are that we can press in our families with our children, our parents, our cousins, our uncles, our relatives, at dinners, at Thanksgivings, and phone calls, whatever, that makes that family member bristle. And this is, to me, The Homecoming, the ultimate family play. Friends of his asked him if he'd been reading Eugene O'Neill when he wrote it, and he was very angry and said, I don't need to read Eugene O'Neill in order to write my own family play. But it is about both the deep love and the incredible vulnerability that exists in a family. And so one of the rules of play is be very careful what you reveal, how vulnerable you are about your secrets. And we're going to find out all the secrets in the course of the play, because you will be immediately made mincemeat of by the rest of the family. Now, who is this family? This is a family of men in which the woman, the one main woman, Jessie, the mother, has died. And so you have this strange circumstance of these motherless, loveless, wifeless men living together in a household where there is no feminine presence. And in fact, they describe, and we're going to talk about the set in a minute, the bizarre room that we are seeing, which is that it was a room with a hallway, and the hallway, the wall got knocked through to make this giant waiting room. And Teddy says to Ruth, the structure wasn't affected, you see. My mother was dead. As if the mother was Atlas holding up the room. And once she's dead, the room falls apart. So, of course, the other woman in the play is Ruth, and she's one of the great creations that Pinter ever made. And I'll just tell you a little bit about how the play got written before we look at the play, because it may give you some insight into what it's all about. It was written in 1963, so this follows The Caretaker and some other short plays. He wrote a sort of homoerotic play, which I think is delicious, that I've directed twice, called The Collection, which you might want to look at sometime, a one-act, a short play. But he was living in Worthing, and I find this very funny. Worthing is a seaside town, and if you've ever heard the name, you may know it's where Oscar Wilde wrote The Importance of Being Earnest. Worthing. It's a very kind of bourgeois English seaside town, very sedate, sort of geriatric, cozy. And that's where Pinter was. Imagine it, in this seaside town with his wife, Vivian Merchant, whom he wrote Ruth for. And if you watch the film from 73, that's Ruth crossing her legs in the room. And his son, Daniel, was a little boy then. And so in a weird way, it was forever associated with that town, even though it's a very violent play, and it takes place in the East End of London. So you remember I told you he came from a poor Jewish family, not of butchers, right? Max is a butcher, but you remember that Pinter's own father was a tailor, and he came from a family of sort of schmata dealers, right? His grandparents came from Odessa. They were pushcart salesmen, and they dealt in cloth. And so there are always jokes in Pinter about being a snappy dresser. Lenny loves to talk to Ruth about clothes and what kind of clothes, and she can't get the right shoes in America, which is considered a kind of wasteland that's not only desiccated and full of insects, but you can't actually get the right clothes. So all of those Jewish tropes are in there, and it is very, very much a play about a Jewish family. So it's quite interesting to think about. The phenomenon, it's in fact based on a real story that happened in Pinter's life. He did say for a Jewish man to bring a shiksa, a non-Jew, was in those days a dread thing to do. Their families considered them to be dead. So it's based on his best friend, Moshe Warnick. And he had this strange thing happened. He married a non-Jewish woman. He never told his family. He emigrated to Canada with his wife. He had 3 children. He never told his family that he was married or had children. And every year he came home to see his father, and he never told him. And it just got worse and worse, because, when you've lied to your family, it just becomes this kind of thing you have to sustain. And his friends and his wife, and eventually even his children, said, this is ridiculous. I think you have to do it. So 10 years after he married, he brought his wife and children back home to meet the family. And it wasn't as disastrous an event as this homecoming is, but clearly it was the springboard for this play. And another wonderful story is that when Peter Hall was filming and wanted to find an exterior in Hackney that they could film when they were shooting, the outside of that sort of forbidding brick house, Pinter was in the car with Peter Hall, and they ring a doorbell, and this old man answers and says, Harold, how are you? It's been ages. And it's an old man wearing a skull cap and plimsolls. You know what those are? Like canvas shoes, like tennis shoes, like old tennis shoes. And that was Moishe Wernick's father, who was this very authoritarian figure. And Harold had remembered him all his life. He was, as Harold said, a tough old bugger, and which I thought was very funny. And so there's a sense kind of that that Pinter was remembering very clearly not only his Jewish family, which was very potent to him, as I said to you, and he was very close to his family, but a kind of archetypal Jewish family. And although clearly this is a play that is violent and nasty, and they say horrible things to each other, Pinter said it's really a play about love and lack of love. So I would go back to this notion that it's partly about the absent mother. And it's also, of course, about a female intruder into this sort of misogynistic, oppressively male household. And so I'm just going to quickly give you the framework in case you didn't get a chance to read it. It's the question of what is a homecoming. So a group of men live in their old family house. Max is the patriarch. He was a butcher all his life, and quite a violent butcher, the chopper in the slab he talks about all the time. And he lives with his brother, who's the opposite, who's slightly effete, very well dressed, very well spoken, very passive aggressive. His name is Sam, and he's a chauffeur. He says he's the best chauffeur in London, and he drives fancy people around to their appointments and out to London airport, things like that. And Sam's cardinal sin that drives Max crazy is he's always cleaning up, washing the dishes, taking over the kitchen so Max can't get into his own kitchen and do what he wants to do. Two of the three sons live at home. One is Lenny, who is obviously some kind of pimp. He works on Greek Street. If you know London, Soho, that's where prostitution happened in London. Greek Street is still sort of a locus of prostitution, although some of Soho is quite expensive now. And so Lenny knows his way around women, and that's what he does. And then there's Joey, the boxer. And in Pinter's own family, his uncle was a boxer. Pinter was very interested in boxing, but poor Joey, I think he's been hit on the head one too many times. He's not quite all there. He's very lonely. Although Lenny says he's had more pussy than you've had, Dolly than you've had cream cakes, he says. So I guess Lenny and Joey drive around and meet women, but he's slow, and he works in demolition by day, and is longing for love and a very sort of lonely soul. Into this house comes Teddy. So the homecoming is the homecoming of the third brother and the transgressive brother. And who is Teddy? He's a kind of arid intellectual who lives in America. And everything about America, the imagery in the play about America, is not what we would think the British might think about America. It's sort of the opposite. You wonder, where are they? At University of Arizona or something? It's very hot. It's very buggy. It's very arid. And there are rocks there, she says. Ruth hates it. They go swimming all the time. It seems to be nice for their three boys, but she finds it a really desiccated, lonely, heat-stricken place. And so interestingly, one has to ask, whose homecoming is this? Because it seems that it may be Ruth's homecoming as much as it is Teddy's. And what do we find out? The men never even knew Teddy was married, the family. He got married the day before he left, and we wonder, oh, this is a good question, by the way. I'm just going to leave because Linda asked, do we have any indication of Joey's age at the time of Jesse's death? It feels like he's approaching Ruth as his mother, which is a very good comment. And the other question that we must consider, and if you read very closely, I think you will see it's an interesting mystery. Is Joey really Max's child? Because one of the primal wounds, and who is the other big offstage character in this play? McGregor. So who is McGregor? The other butcher, the butcher who hand in glove with Max created this a kind of violent brotherhood of aggressive butchers who lived by this, chopper and the slab in this kind of consortium of butchers. It's quite disturbing. Yes, he's described in his mid-20s. You're absolutely right, Debbie, and Joey. But you have to wonder, whose child is he really? And the thing we discover, as I was saying, when you consider that one of the rules of play in this play is keep the mask up, don't show your vulnerability. The other rule is when you're attacking, don't show what you're doing. But at the climactic moment in the play, which we're going to get to when we look at part 2, Sam looks at Max and says, McGregor had Jesse in the back of my car. And we know that that is the primal wound for Max. We know that McGregor had a thing for Jesse. We know that Sam had a thing for Jesse. Sam loved Jesse. He talks about her all the time. But what he seems to have done is permitted Max, his brother's wife, to have sex with his brother's partner in the back of his cab. And we don't know whether it's possible that Joey is the offspring of that relationship, but there are suggestions that that could be true. Remember that paternity has always been a great theme in drama. I don't know if you know Strindberg's play, The Father. It's one of the great plays ever written. It is his answer to Ibsen's A Doll's House. And one of the things, it's true of Oedipus, for God's sake, you know, that men always have to struggle with is paternity. At least as beaten down as women have been throughout the history of the patriarchy, they know when they give birth that it's their child, and men don't. And so who is Max? He is an anxious father who has 3 sons, one of whom may not be his. And who comes home but the son who has gone off and been successful, and successful in the strangest way. He hasn't been successful in the family business. He's not a butcher. He's not a tailor. He doesn't live in the East End. He doesn't do any of the things that any of those Jewish families did. He's gone off not only to become an academic, but a kind of arid philosopher of logic. And this is really interesting. If you want more on this subject, Pinter wrote the screenplay of a film called The Apprentice, which is also about an academic. And he was very cynical about academics. As I told you in my first lecture, he never went to university. He was hugely self-taught and deeply intellectual, but he was suspicious of theory, which he always thought was not real and only a kind of a mind fuck in a way. You know, it's kind of a manipulation of how real human beings feel. What does Lenny ask Teddy in the second act of the play? He basically says, do you believe in anything? You know, how do you relate to an almighty being? How do you know if there is such a thing? And he's sort of saying to Teddy, tell me what you really feel. And Teddy keeps saying, that lies outside my purview. I can't answer that one. He has this very narrow academic discipline, but he's actually done very well by it. And so the two of them have gone to Venice, and Venice is going to be a locus of bad marriage to Pinter. I don't know why this is true, because he went there often with Antonia Fraser, whom he adored. But when we get to Betrayal, you will see that many bad things, secrets happen between couples. I guess Venice is a place you go on honeymoon, or you go when you think it's going to be romantic, and then it exposes all the lies, because in Betrayal, we're going to see that that's the place where Emma's husband discovers that she's been having an affair with Jerry for 7 years in Venice. So Venice, they've gone to Venice, and now they've come home. And the play asks the question, what is home, and whose home is it? So when this play opened in London in 1963, it was unbelievable how people wrote about it. It didn't get as bad reviews as The Birthday Party did, but it certainly raised many questions in the eyes of many people about what did it mean, particularly what did the second act of the play mean. And one of the big questions is it deeply misogynistic, or is it a feminist play? There have been so many analyses of the play. I wanted to sort of come up with like a whole list for you, but it goes on forever. Here are a few. There are people who interpreted it as a kind of archaic rite of sacrifice, the ritual king, like in the Golden Bough, if you've ever read the Golden Bough, the ritual king is defeated by the arrival of the fertility goddess who comes with a new conqueror in this kind of mythic way and dethrones the king. There is no question it is a kind of Lear-like play. Pinter loved Lear, he knew Lear by heart, and it is a play about a patriarch getting deposed, however you want to interpret that. You know, is it a play about power and territory? Is it a sort of Freudian fever dream, a kind of Oedipal sexual contact, you know, where the son, you know, there's a conquest of the mother and a humiliation of the father? Is it a kind of, you know, Freudian metaphor? Is it a kind of sociologically accurate study of the tribal behavior of a group of East End predators? In other words, is this how a tribe of Jewish brothers would behave when betrayed by one of their own? Is it a feminist challenge to male despotism, to the, you know, to the sort of binary classification of women as either mothers or whores, sort of challenging all those patriarchal assumptions and exposing the vulnerability of men? And of course, in many ways, it's all of those things. It's also, I will tell you, hilarious. I don't know if you could tell it was hilarious if you watch the film, because comedy, you never get the laughs on film, and they also can't play the pauses and the silences the way you would do on stage. So I don't know if you could get how hilarious, for instance, Lenny's monologues are, which we're going to talk about it in a minute, but you could get, I think, if you watch Vivian Merchant, the kind of potency of a very self-possessed woman who owns her own body, who charts her own course, who decides at every moment what she is going to do. She's told to sit down, she doesn't sit. She's told she's tired, she says she isn't. She's told to go to bed, and she walks right out the door. She's told to drink a glass of water, and she says she'll pour it down the other guy's throat if he lies on the ground. I mean, she absolutely at every moment gains tactical advantage of her opponents. So Ruth was fascinating, and obviously he wrote it for Vivian, who had that kind of heat and that ability to dominate a scene while remaining kind of completely silent. So I'm going to show you, I'm going to share my screen now, and I'd like to show you, if I do play from start, here we go. These are the pictures we looked at of the birthday party. I'd like to show you what we did scenically. Can you all see that?
Yeah, that looks great.
Okay, so here's the first challenge of doing this play. I do believe it's meant to be done in an absolutely closed environment. I did this at the Geary, which is, as I said to you about the birthday party, a very large theater. And so I had to figure out how to make this room both enormous, because they keep describing it as a very big room, but also claustrophobic and dangerous. So you will notice, if you look at the left of the photo, that we made these walls that were slabs that canted inwards. Do you see how this wall where the door is, it feels like it's leaning in? So it's a kind of forced perspective wall. And the same thing is the case on the back wall. It leans towards the audience. I don't know if you can really tell that from this image, but the reason we decided to do this, and it was designed by a wonderful designer called Daniel Osling, is I was thinking a lot about the strange description that Pinter gives you at the beginning of the play. He says, the back wall, which contained the door, has been removed. A square arch shape remains. Beyond it, the hall. In the hall, a staircase is standing up left, well in view. The front door upright, a coat stand, hooks, etc. And then he talks about the chairs and things like this. Now, so you think, why is this a room? Why did the wall get knocked out? Something odd happened there after the mother died. Is it a waiting room? Were they scared that someone was going to come down the hall and, you know, pop in on them? Why did these boys want to break up that room that way. But what you do know is the room is completely devoid of any feminine comfort, right? She's dead, and it's this enormous empty space. And the only thing in it are these pieces of furniture, a couch, a poof. You know, he calls this a poof. And by the way, that's a piece of furniture, this footstool poof, which Pinter was obsessed with and comes up over and over again in his play, The Collection, which I think is very funny. And this chair in the middle, which is Max's throne. And that throne is incredibly important. You have to think of the furniture as islands, I think, in a vast and empty lake. And they are islands to be conquered. So who sits where, who lies on top of whom, who controls the furniture is central to the staging and the kind of architecture of the play. So in the set, we did two things. We decided to cant the walls. We made oversized stuffed furniture, and we made a staircase, which was vast. This is not a naturalistic staircase. It had 22 steps. Why did we do this? Because as I said to you with the birthday party, in Pinter, going upstairs is walking towards your doom. In the birthday party, going up the staircase is going up towards Stanley's room, towards the sexual predatory life of Megan Stanley, but it's also going upstairs to where Goldberg is staying and where he ultimately destroys Stanley. In the birthday party's original production, the staircase was not seen, but Pinter obviously learned after that it's much more interesting to see the staircase. You see the ascent. So this is Anthony Fusco as Teddy going upstairs, and Andy Polk as Lenny watching him go upstairs. So it is an enormous ascent and assault going to the childhood bedrooms and to the place where sex is going to happen with Ruth. And in Act 2, when Joey has sex with Ruth, and then he has to come downstairs after not, quote, going the whole hog, you watch him descend with incredible humiliation all the way down those stairs. So there was something kind of miraculous about the stairs that Daniel Osling designed. This sort of frightening, epic quality of it that we thought was really exciting. Okay. Now, this is Act 1, Scene 2. So again, I just wanted to give you a wide shot so you could see the canted walls, as I showed you, this enormous recessed window, that's very important, and the stage left wall over here, right, with the Hoover leaning against it, which is also leaning in. So do you see the way the set pushes the characters towards each other? There's no comfort, but there's also almost no escape. And this giant window, which they're going to lean against to look out, there's a long moment where Ruth looks out at the window. Here's Ruth, played by Renee Augustin. This is Teddy. This is Joey, played by Adam O'Byrne. This is Max, played by Jack Willis, and Sam, played by Kenny Welsh. The throne stays center stage, but this window both looks like an object of freedom, but also something that could crash in at any moment and kind of destroy them. Now, the other thing we did is, here's an image of the top of Act 2, which are it's the men smoking, and they are standing underneath a chandelier. So I wanted to show you this, to describe another thing which we decided to do in our production, which had to do with lighting. But I'm going to go back to this image to show you what I mean about the lighting. So let me just make this bigger so you can see it again. Here we go. Here. Okay. Now, if you read this play very carefully, what you will learn is that Harold Pinter is not only a master of dialogue and comedy and menace, but he visualized every moment of the play. And in particular, because he had acted in so many thrillers, he visualized the lighting. And so what I decided to do was just heighten what Pinter had already suggested and make it like a film noir where the lighting was all to be controlled by what is on stage called practicals. So a practical on stage is something like, you see this standing lamp beside the couch. You see this lamp in the center beside Max's chair. You see these two lamps beside the sideboard where the cheese roll crisis is going to happen. And you see this light switch by the door. Those control all the lighting stages in the production. And what I decided to do in rehearsal was board up the windows in the rehearsal room. I know this sounds crazy, but it really worked. So that and put practicals in the room. It meant the actors had to learn their text much more quickly than they would have because they couldn't otherwise see it. But it meant that they could not be seen in the rehearsal room unless they operated one of the practicals. Why did I do this? Because in a play about control and domination and territory and home, the person who controls the light switch controls the destiny of the next scene. So for example, in the scene where Teddy and Ruth come home, which is the second scene of Act 1, Lenny knows where those light switches are. He sends Teddy up the stairs, and Teddy is lit because the light at the top of the stairs is controlled by the light switch by the door. And so in a sense, Lenny drives him up those stairs, and Lenny wins the point. The way that I set that up was from the very first moment that Ruth and Teddy arrive. So you will remember that in the first scene of the play, it's quite bright and it's morning in the play, and there is a long scene with Max and Joey and Sam. And then halfway through, there's a blackout in the middle of Act 1, just like there is in the middle of the scenes in The Caretaker, a blackout that's like a boxing ring gong going off, totally creepy. And then Max and Sam have to disappear like a magic trick. And when the lights come back up, you hear a sound. Do you remember I told you about the sound of the newspaper ripping in the homecoming, in the birthday party, and how thrilling that is in the blackout? So in this blackout, you hear the sound of a key in a lock. So you have to really mic that. And then you hear a door being open and you see a shaft of light coming from the open door. And then Teddy hits a light switch, right? So you see two characters in silhouette, Ruth and Teddy, and then he hits the light switch and the chandelier goes on, which exposes Max's throne. And that chandelier, I hope you can see it in this picture, right, is there, and that illuminates Max's throne. But that chandelier also illuminates the erotic scene in part 2 when Lenny and Ruth are dancing and they start to kiss, and Joey says, "Oh, they're wide open. She's wide open, Dad." That's under the chandelier. And then there's going to be this light switch by the couch when Ruth and Teddy roll on the couch. So controlling that opening image and that light switch, became a delicious thing to do. And in this scene where the men are smoking cigars under the light switch, it's like a kind of cabal of middle-aged men with their smoke signals underneath the now I'm going to stop sharing this and I'm going to share a different set of images with you in a moment. But that gives you a sense of what the visual landscape was. I did keep the play roughly in its period. Again, this is completely up to the discretion of the director. There are many productions that sort of updated and changed it, and I think it's a completely universal play. But I will say this. The relationship between realism and myth in The Homecoming is a very hard balance to strike. And if you make the set too abstract, too mythic, too obviously of another world, as you will see when we look at The Homecoming next week, there was a production that was set on an ice floe, where you could see glaciers in the distance. what that does is it makes the actual naturalistic behavior on stage harder to believe and harder to justify. And I think that what makes these plays so creepy and hilarious is, like a David Lynch movie, that they could just about be real. Do you know what I'm saying? If it's too surreal and the characters aren't grounded in any kind of reality, then you wonder what holds it together. You know, what gives it a kind of, I don't know, what gives it the texture that allows the plays to feel like real character plays. And I think they are real character plays. I think we have all witnessed all the time families where the patriarch, or look at Dianne Feinstein, or the matriarch does not want to give up control of her territory, where the next generation gets in there and tries to figure out ways to either help or control or get rid of that generation. It's a kind of universal thing where, you know, somebody who's the outlier or who's been away comes back to take over the family mansion or whatever. So I think that I tried to strike a balance between the realism of the world of it and the kind of surrealness of the encounters. And I'm just going to show you one or two, sorry, no, wrong one. One or two more images, which I have, these are just from my website, but I just wanted you to see, here's the portrait of the family, which we just did just for fun. But this image, I wanted you to take a look at, which was the famous scene with Ruth and Lenny and the glass. So I want to talk about that scene for a moment in isolation, and then I'm going to go through and do some work on the text itself and show you kind of how the play works. But I want to pick up on something that we talked about when we did the birthday party, and that is about props and the kind of magic tricks that props in Pinter always reveal. There are very few items or hand props in the homecoming. And as with the birthday party, I made sure to design it so there wasn't anything else on stage to distract you from those very particular and unique props, which become iconic and sort of, as Joyce would say, epiphanic. You know, they're sort of epiphanies when you use those props. For instance, in the very first scene, when Sam comes home, he says to Max, "I'm feeling a bit peckish." And he goes and picks up an apple off the bowl by the sideboard. It's the only thing of color on the whole stage. And you have to decide as a director, is it a green apple? Is it a red apple? And what does it sound like when you bite it? Because that apple is a form of aggression that Max uses against that Sam uses against Max, and it's really important that it be as precise as possible. The same thing is true of this astonishing scene in Act 1, Scene 2, when Teddy has gone up to bed and Ruth takes off her coat and is asked to sit down on, or chooses to sit down on Max's throne. And Lenny is in his pajamas. So already in the game of chicken between Ruth and Lenny, he's at a disadvantage because she is fully dressed and could get up and walk out the door at any minute, and he's in his pajamas. He tries to dominate her. He's never met a woman like this, one thinks, although it becomes clear later on that he may have known her. She may have been his whore. We don't know, but they seem in Act 2 very closely related. And he asks her to have a glass of water. And he pours it for her and he puts it on the table and he tells her to drink. And it's simply a glass of water, right? There's nothing to it. And yet it becomes the locus of all of their sexual and predatory relationship. So he pours the glass. He gives this outrageous speech that is meant to dominate her and terrorize her about a whore that he almost tried to kill once. And then he says to her, and now perhaps I'll relieve you of your glass. And she says, I haven't quite finished. And he says, you've consumed quite enough, in my opinion. And she says, no, I haven't. He says, quite sufficient, in my own opinion. And she says, not in mine, Leonard. Now, you will remember that using somebody's name, like a maiden name or a childhood name or a Jewish name, is often a strategy of control. How did she know his name was Leonard? Who knows? But she says it, and there's a pause, and he is incredibly defensive and says to her, don't call me that, please. Ruth says, why not? Lenny says, that's the name my mother gave me. And it's a kind of vulnerability exactly as happened with Goldberg in the birthday party, right? That the name, your personal private name, is like a talisman. And when somebody else knows it and uses it, it's as if it's Rumpelstiltskin and they have power over you. And he gets terrified and says, just give me the glass. And his mask starts to drop. And she says, no. And then there's a pause because it's a total standoff and you think, what's going to happen? And after all, what difference does it make? It's half a glass of water, right? But the glass of water becomes this magical icon. So then Lenny has to try another chess move and says, I'll take it then. Ruth says, if you take the glass, ... I'll take you. An incredible card to throw down a sexual threat. And Lenny, who pretends to be incredibly sexually smart, really exposes his own impotence. And there's a pause and he doesn't know what to do because he's terrified of being taken by Ruth. And he says, how about me taking the glass without you taking me? And she says, why don't I just take you? She doesn't even need the glass. She could just take him if she wants. And there's a pause and he says, you're joking. This is the first woman who's probably ever stood up to Lenny. And there's a pause where she smiles and all the cards are in her hand and he's completely flummoxed and says, you're in love anyway with another man. You've had a secret liaison with another man. His family didn't even know. Then you come here without a word of warning and you start to make trouble. And what does she do? She picks up the glass, she lifts it towards him and she says, have a sip. Go on, have a sip from my glass. And he's still total silent. And then even more extreme, she says, sit on my lap. Take a long, cool sip. She pats her lap. There's a pause. She stands. She moves towards him with the glass. Put your head back and open your mouth. He says, take that glass away from me, as if it's a weapon. She says, lie on the floor. Go on. I'll pour it down your throat. He says, what are you doing? Making me some kind of proposal? She laughs. She drains the glass. She says, oh, I was thirsty. Smiles at him, puts the glass down, goes into the hall, and goes up the stairs. So how do you do that scene? Well, lighting is absolutely critical. We had a green lamp, like a banker's lamp. You see it in this picture. It matches the green of her dress. It gives her all the power. So what did we do? We did precise choreography. So all the other lights in the room are off. The green lamp is glowing on Ruth and on the glass. And if you really carefully tech it, and it took forever to get this thing right, you can sort of let the light refract through the glass as if it is kind of a beacon of sexual promise. And it makes the glass almost exist outside time. It draws Lenny and Ruth to it like moths. And you see who is going to dominate that glass. And whoever dominates the glass wins the battle. As soon as she finishes the sip, she puts it down and it's nothing. It's just a glass again. And she goes upstairs and Lenny is absolutely defanged and starts yelling after her, you know, because he doesn't know what to make of it, saying, what was it supposed to be? Some kind of proposal? And there's silence. And he realizes he has an incredibly formidable adversary. So, you know, this is just one example of the way in which lighting and you know, the textures of lighting and what is lit can make what seems like a quotidian, ordinary scene into something incredibly heightened and dangerous, but it's just lighting. It's just a real lamp. It's not horror light. It's not a footlight. It's not a theatrical light. This is where Pinter's so brilliant. It's like the flashlight, which he called the torch, in Stanley's face at the end of the game of Blind Man's Buff. If an ordinary person had walked in that room, they wouldn't have seen anything out of the ordinary. People shine flashlights at each other. But for us, it's like a horror movie. So this is the way we tried to sculpt the lighting, the sound, the set design of this piece, so that the air would never go out until that final terrifying scene in which Ruth takes over the universe of the play. Okay, so I just want to give you an example now, starting back in Act 1 at the top of the play, of how the language works. And the reason I want to do this is because I think by the homecoming, Pinter had finally figured out how to fuse observed naturalistic speech, the way people really talk, the way his relatives, like Goldberg, nattering on about Simpkiss and stuff, really talked, with a kind of distilled poetry of threat that raised the stakes in a way that nobody, I don't think no playwright had ever done before. And what I want to say about that is that the language sets the scene or it gives the director and actors instructions of how to behave when approaching the play. Here's the deal. Most playwrights are not nearly this precise. Pinter talked with director Peter Hall about pursuing the facts, the precise facts of the scene. And by that, he meant the exact present tense here and now setup, so that every detail contributes to the whole. In more naturalistic plays, even like in most contemporary naturalistic plays that you could read or see today, the lighting isn't so meticulous or precise. The language isn't that meticulous and precise. The design doesn't have to be that meticulous and precise. It's more like television drama, and you sort of, it's a kind of imitation of naturalism that television does. Pinter distills the world into a kind of chess game, and it means every move is like a move of chess. So just like in a chess game, you can't be sloppy. You can't move a knight who's supposed to move 2 up and 1 across the way you would move a pawn, or you'll destroy the game. And I think in Pinter, that game is meticulous. And if you don't pay attention to the meticulous details of the choreography, who's standing, who's sitting, what the furniture looks like, where the props pop, you've kind of lost what's powerful about the play. In some ways, if you look at a play like O'Neill's Long Day's Journey into Night, you could certainly see that for O'Neill, the sound of Mary Tyrone's steps walking upstairs while she was on morphine are the heartbeat of that play. And if you don't get that right, and you don't make a room for Long Day's Journey into Night, which is this constrained prison of a family nightmare based on O'Neill's own family home in New London, Connecticut, way too small for a group of men the size of the Tyrones. If you don't attend to that and design a set that contains that and makes the pressure of that upstairs feel unbearable, the play will diffuse. Does that make sense? So, it's not that there's necessarily a right or wrong. The question is, what keeps the pot boiling? What keeps the rubber band stretched? I know these are all cliched metaphors, but that's your job as a director. Never let the tension up. It doesn't mean you're yelling all the time. In fact, the contrary. I'm sure you've all gone to plays where the actors are encouraged to just yell all the time as if that created tension. It's the opposite. When that happens, it means there's no variety and there's no moment where silence suddenly arrests you and you think, oh, now what's going to be said? But Pinter orchestrates that every step of the way. And it's your job as a director and actors to pay attention to that. So I'm just going to read you the very beginning, and I'll give you all the clues about how the play works. It's evening. Lenny is sitting on the sofa with a newspaper in a dark suit. So it's a guy in a dark suit. You don't know. Is he a professional? Who is he? He's making marks on the paper, and you think, what is he doing? You find out he's reading the racing page. Max comes in from the kitchen. He rummages around, and he's wearing an old cardigan and a cap. So he's not a working guy. You wonder what he's doing. And he says, it's such an amazing first line. What have you done with the scissors? It's so violent. Like, who's looking for scissors and why? We are going to find out that this man is a butcher. One of the salient things about a butcher is, and this is important to the nature of the room, he keeps his abattoir clean, right? He's going to say this over and over again. I keep it clean. And yet when Sam cleans the room, it drives him crazy. But he scrubs the blood off everything. But if you remember the images I showed you of the room, they look like an abattoir wall, sort of covered with blood, like a Richard Serra sculpture, but scrubbed clean. It's not like the Caretaker. It's not a slum covered in stuff. It has nothing in it. It's like an empty butcher's abattoir. And the butcher says, what have you done with the scissors? And then there's a pause. Lenny says nothing. He repeats, I said, I'm looking for the scissors. What have you done with them? So this accusation between a father and the son that the son has stolen the scissors. Then there's another pause. So twice the son ignores him. That is such a passive aggressive thing to do, and it puts Lenny in charge, right? And then Max says, did you hear me? Then he explains what he wants the scissors for. I want to cut something out of the paper. Once again, where does the territory lie? In a piece of newspaper. It's only a newspaper. It's like Petey. It's nothing. It's worth nothing. But suddenly Pinter says, watch the newspaper. Who's got the newspaper? Lenny finally answers. And what does he say? I'm reading the paper. So he says, it's my territory. Fuck you, Dad. It's mine. And Max says, not that paper. I haven't even read that paper. He's going to get to it, right? I'm talking about last Sunday's paper. I was just having a look at it in the kitchen. Lenny doesn't say anything. He deliberately ignores him, which is such an actively aggressive thing to do. Another pause. Max says, did you hear what I'm saying? I'm talking to you. Where's the scissors? And finally, Lenny looks up and he says to his father, why don't you shut up, you daft prat? To say to his father. So Max picks up his stick and he points at him and says, don't talk to me like that. I'm warning you. Now, the rule of play in this play is don't show when you've been wounded, because if you do, you're going to get decimated. But Max shows it. It upsets him, right? And so what does he have to do in order to reclaim his power, his territory? He sits in his armchair. Watch that every step of the way in the play. Look at who's sitting in the big chair. That's the territory. And then Pinter, master of comedy, undercuts the tension by saying, there's an advertisement in the paper about flannel vests. Cut price, Navy surplus. I could do with a few of them. So there he is, yelling at his son, and then he talks about underwear. And that's like classic Pinter, opening gambit. And then he pretends to relax. I think I'll have a fag. Give me a fag. No response. I asked you to give me a cigarette. Look what I'm lumbered with. And he gets so defensive that he has to start haranguing his son with the first of Max's many monologues. So you remember I read you that brilliant essay of Pinter's called Writing for the Theater, in which he said there are two kinds of silence: the silence that is a torrent of words and the silence that is true absence of speech. Both betray vulnerability and terror. So because Max is scared that his son has won the point, he starts verbal diarrhea. He just can't stop talking. And that aggression is to try and reclaim territory in the room by saying, you remember Mac, eh? Ha! We were two of the worst hated men in the West End of London. I tell you, I've still got the scars. Now, we're going to later find out that this guy, Max, screwed his wife in the back of his brother's car. So why does he bring up Max? He tries to neutralize Max as an enemy by saying he was very fond of your mother. Max was very fond. He always had a good word for her. So he says this so that he won't get caught out, right? About saying something about the man who, in a way, was his arch enemy, but also was the person that he admired the most. Anyway, then he starts talking about fillies and women and how he could control women and how he could control fillies, horses, female horses, by staring them in the eyes. And he's going to claim that throughout the whole play. And then, but Lenny keeps winning the points, and then Sam comes in. And it's one of the most sort of moving things I find in the play. Immediately, Lenny is very polite to him. Hello, Uncle Sam. Hello, how are you, Uncle? Not bad, a bit tired. Tired? I bet you're tired. Where you been? I've been to London Airport. And they talk, and then there's a pause, and then Max says, I'm here too, you know. And again, Max betrays his desperate need to be seen, to be noticed. Pinter said, as violent as this play was, it was a play about love and lack of love. And you really understand how desperate each of them is to be at the center of attention and to be needed, to be loved by all of the other family members. You know, and Sam thinks he's, you know, the best driver ever, and that you know, competition immediately is ignited between those two brothers. So and Max kind of scorns him and says, what you been doing, banging away at your lady customers? And Sam wins the point. He says, I've never done that kind of thing in my car. Max says, above all that kind of thing, are you, Sam? Too true. Above having a good bang on the back seat, are you? And Sam says, yes, I leave that to others. Now we're going to find out who the other is. It's going to be McGregor and Jesse. And Max gets defensive. We don't know that yet. You leave it to others. What others? You paralyzed prat. So we see that Max has been wounded. And Sam knows he's won. I don't mess up my car or my ... my boss's car like other people. Max says, other people? What other people? What other people? Sam just says, other people. So this is how these fights, these territories work. And then poor Joey comes in, and Joey's hungry, and there's all kinds of interaction between them. And then finally, before the blackout, Max looks at the men in his life, Joey, Lenny, Sam, and he says, look what I'm lumbered with. One cast iron bunch of crap after another. One flow of stinking pus after another. Look at the imagery this man uses about his own family. Our Father, and remember, just like Goldberg, take charge of your own past. Weaponize your own past. Don't let anybody else use your past the way you use it. I remember him, don't worry. You kid yourself. He used to come over to me and look down at me, my old man did. He'd bend right over me. And then he'd pick me up. I was only that big. Then he'd dandle me. Such a creepy sort of sexualized image. Give me the bottle, wipe me clean, give me a smile, pat me on the bum, pass me around as if you were meat, right? Pass me around from hand to hand, toss me up in the air, catch me coming down. I remember my father. Now, this image of children being thrown is going to be another central image that Pinter uses over and over again, and it's going to be particularly crucial in Betrayal, in terms of this thing that we've been talking about all along in Pinter, about who colonizes which memory, right? So different people are going to claim different memories and fight over whose memory is correct. Just quickly before we take a break, Linda's asking, do we think Max and Lenny's threats are more Shakespearean or more Yiddish? I think that's a great question, and they're both. I mean, sometimes they're incredibly crass. Notice the repeated use of the sound, the C sound. He loves clock, tick, all those sounds, crap, stinking pus, and sometimes it's very Shakespearean. Debbie's saying, I hope I'm not alone in not finding the comedy in these plays. I'm always tense. You're right, but they are also absolutely hilarious. And it really depends on how they're played. And I'll tell you why the comedy works in two ways. One is incredible tension, and then I think I'll buy some flannel underwear. So the reversal makes you laugh. The other is the more aggressive the speech is, the lighter they need to be done. And I think that's a very missed opportunity in the film of The Homecoming, because when Lenny gives the monologue about the mangle, he does it with incredible aggression in the movie, but actually it's hilarious if he's talking about braining this woman, but he's really cheerful and he smiles the whole time. And then he says, I didn't do anything because I felt jubilant, which is such an amazing word to use about snow. So I think, it is the kind of comedy that makes one grimace. But I'll tell you, if you do it right on stage, it's hilarious. And then you want to cringe. So it should be both. All right, let us take a break. It's about 1:59. So why don't we come back at 2:05 and we'll keep going.
You're ready. Thank you.
I just wanted to answer 2 questions before I hit Act 2. Linda asking, was Mamet influenced by Pinter? Enormously. I don't think he's nearly as great a playwright. And we could talk about that if you're interested in my opinion on that one, but whatever. But as Pinter always sent the first drafts of his plays to Samuel Beckett, whom he revered, Mamet always sent the first drafts of his plays to Pinter. And it is absolutely true that Mamet's kind of tough staccato language, in a sense, and the disconnect between affect and content, and the masking and the kind of predatory quality of Mamet, always be selling, owes an enormous amount to Pinter. I think the biggest difference is that Mamet has no sexuality. Mamet is not interested in women. And by that, I don't mean that he's not nice to women, although he isn't. He has no interest in women. He's never written really a 3-dimensional female character. Even Oleana, the female student, is kind of, what do I want to say? Just a manipulative kind of cipher. I don't think that Mamet has that in him. I think Mamet is a man's man. He's interested in, Glengarry Glen Ross is his masterpiece, and he's interested in a collection of men behaving badly, and they behave badly brilliantly. I think they are brilliant plays, but I think they're limited, and I don't think they have the kind of humanity and depth and staying power that Pinter has, for lots of reasons, but partly because of that. It's also, Mamet was awful to work with and Pinter was wonderful to work with. So I have very different personal experiences of being in the room with them. Catherine's asking, do audiences enjoy Pinter's plays? All I can tell you is they were the biggest sellers we ever had at the Geary, which was always surprising, but it's like catnip for actors. They are so much fun to perform because they're just bottomless, because you have to do 2 things. You have to have an enormous inner life, right? With a lot of need and fear and desire and hope and bitterness and longing and love. And then you have to mask it. And where the mask falls, you get caught. And so it's just incredibly fun to play. And I think hilarious in its horror. The end of Act 1 of The Homecoming is one of the creepiest father-seen sons I've ever read, where Teddy says, come on then. Teddy moves a step towards his father. Come on, pause. And Max says, you still love your old dad, eh? And in any other play, that would be loving. But in Pinter, you think, uh-oh, don't go near. Teddy says, come on, Dad. I'm ready for the cuddle. Now, cuddle, what a brilliant use of language. What other playwright would put these 2 vile, venal, aggressive, toxic men on stage and use the word cuddle, right? Just as he used the word dandle. He used to dandle me. And it's that disconnect between the language, the affect, and the intent that is hilarious. And I think also very moving. I find the plays really moving. And I think in the end, this is a play about a family that's been destroyed when the mother died. And I think, that is a universal and profound thing. How do people get over the loss of the matriarch? And you'll see, we're going to take a quick look. I know I don't have a lot of time at part 2, because Act 2 is Ruth's act. And I will say that when this play was in previews in Boston for the Broadway tryout, the producers, the critic, Elliot Norton, thought it was deranged. He thought Act 2 was just completely deranged. And the producers, Roger Stevens and Robert Whitehead, went to Pinter and said, well, what are you going to do about the second act of the play, Mr. Pinter? And he took off his glasses and his eyes gleamed and he said, what did you have in mind? Just like Max. I mean, he wasn't going to touch it. That was his play. Now imagine 1965, a play in which a married woman ends up in a house of men where she proceeds to offer herself like a whore to every single man in the room, and then negotiate her own prostitution. It's shocking, but I think if you set up the first act right, it's also logical, and it sort of makes sense. So it starts, and here this goes back again to the question of humor. They're smoking their cigars, and you'd think this was just a nice Jewish family play. And Max says, well, it's a long time since the whole family was together, eh? If only your mother was alive, eh? What do you say, Sam? What would Jesse say? So he's poking that wound again, right? Sitting here with her 3 sons, 3 fine grown-up boys, and a lovely daughter-in-law. The only shame is her grandchildren aren't here. She'd have petted them and cooed over them, wouldn't she, Sam? She'd have fussed over them and played with them, told them stories, tickled them. I tell you, she'd have been hysterical. And again, you suddenly get to that noun and you think, hysterical? The grandmother? Why? And then she says to Ruth, mind you, she taught these boys everything they know. Well, that's a really creepy thing to say about the wife, since we've got a pimp, a boxer, a completely amoral husband. So it was, and then he describes his whole life with her. He was going around the country to find meat, whatever that metaphor means. And he left this woman at home with a will of iron, a heart of gold, and a mind, right, Sam? What a mind. And then he describes, the dresses he wanted her to buy and all that kind of thing. And he tries to maintain this notion of the beautiful past, but he can't control it. Why? Because really in Act 2, Max's total MO is fear. He knows, because he's smart, he smelled it. An enemy has come. And who is the enemy? Teddy. So when Peter Hall wrote about this play, and he was the first director to do it, he said that what he discovered, and it seems counterintuitive, but I think he was absolutely right, is that the real villain in the play is Teddy. That he is cold and narcissistic. He has abandoned the family, and he will do anything to either come home on his own terms, invade the house, set the rules, and come home on his own terms, or he will abandon them again and go make his way in the world. And so what you start to see is that there's no center to Teddy, that he's like ice. And that's why he wins, because he's not vulnerable where the other characters are vulnerable. The longer Max gives about these terrorizing monologues, the more vulnerable he is. But I think they're absolutely hilarious. It makes the bile come up in my mouth, the bile, you understand? He says to Ruth, I worked as a butcher all my life using the chopper and the slab, you know what I mean? The chopper and the slab to keep my family in luxury, And I mean, it's like a sort of deranged example of power, as opposed to his brother, who he says all his life, he sat in the front seat giving lovely hand signals. So the implication is they all care about is sex. It's just what kind of sex it is. He starts to test the waters, and then Ruth says something very revealing, and the secrets of the second act are Ruth's secrets. So the question is, who is she? Who is this wife that he has married and taken to America? Max says, you're a charming woman. And she says, I was ... So she's about to talk about her past. And Max says, what? And there's a pause. So everybody leans forward. Who is Ruth? What's her secret? How do we control her? Max says, what'd she say? They all look at Ruth. And Ruth says, now remember we talked about the 3 kinds of silence? There's the ellipsis, 3 dots. That's a hesitation. There's the pause, which is anxiety, where the audience can look from one to the other. And there's a silence where the bottom drops out. So she says, I was ... dot, 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 different, dot, 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 when I met Teddy, dot, 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 first. And you think, different? How? And he very quickly says, no, you weren't. You were the same. So the implication of the second act starts to be that this is Ruth's homecoming and she knows this neighborhood and she was on the game too. She starts to describe her life as a model, which is a euphemism, obviously, for prostitution. And she's obviously been around the block. And it may be that she's been around Lenny's block and that she and Lenny knew each other. It may even be that she and Lenny have slept together. We don't know. But he stops it. Teddy stops the speculation and tries to control her. No, you weren't. You were the same. And Ruth says, I wasn't. And then Max says, who cares? Listen, live in the present. What are you worrying about? Don't forget the Earth's about 5,000 million years old, at least. Who can afford to live in the past after he's just been living in the past, right? So the question is she going to tell? Teddy leaps into the void. He says she's a great help to me over there. She's a wonderful wife and mother, full of cliches about Ruth. And then Lenny says something to Teddy that I think is such a great metaphor. He looks at him and says, your cigar's gone out, which is completely, his testosterone's down. It's totally phallocentric. And Teddy has to say to Lenny, so is yours. So we have these two brothers making dick jokes at each other. And who is winning? Ruth. And then Teddy says, you haven't told us very much about your job. This says Lenny, what do you teach? Philosophy. Well, I want to ask you something. Do you detect a certain logical incoherence in the central affirmations of Christian theism? And basically, he's about to ask, what do you believe? And Teddy says, which shows you exactly how amoral he is, that he stands for nothing. He says, that question doesn't fall within my province, right? So it's all about territory. He's saying, get out of my territory. And Lenny says, no, I'm not going to get out of your territory. And what you see is Lenny's much smarter. He may not be an academic. He may be a pimp, but he's much smarter than Teddy. And he says, you don't mind me asking you some questions, do you? Teddy says, if they're within my province. Well, look at it this way. How can the unknown merit reverence? In other words, how can you revere that of which you're ignorant? Which is the classic question about God. And it's the same thing that Goldberg and McCann do to Stanley. What about the Albigensionist heresy? What do you believe? It's this question that Pinter wrestles with all the time. He doesn't believe organized religion ever really answers it, which is, how do you prove that what you believe exists? How do you prove there's a God? It's not logical. What makes faith happen? And how does religion control it? Teddy keeps saying, I'm afraid I'm the wrong person to ask. But you're a philosopher. Come on, be frank. What do you make of all this business of being and non-being? Teddy can't answer. So he says, what do you make of it? And they go back and forth. Teddy starts to lose. And then Ruth says, you've forgotten something. Look at me. I, ... move my leg. That's all it is. But I wear ... underwear ... which moves with me. It captures your attention. Perhaps you misinterpret. The action is simple. It's a leg moving. My lips move. Why don't you restrict ... your observations to that? So she claims control immediately. The guys are totally emasculated. She says, stop treating me like an object. I can behave. I'll objectify myself if I want to, but I'm at the center of this discourse, and you don't have to decide whether you believe in me or not, because I'm here, and I'm going to tell you the truth. I was born quite near here. Then ... 6 years ago, I went to America. She doesn't say 6 years ago in the movie. It's 9 years ago. I married Teddy. She says I went to America, and then she says it's all rock and sand. It stretches so far, everywhere you look. And there's lots of insects there. There's a pause. And then I think she looks at Teddy and says, and there's lots of insects. And Teddy, her husband, is one such insect. It is completely clear this is a loveless marriage. She wants nothing more to do with Teddy, and Teddy knows it. He has tried to control her. He's tried to make her go to bed. He's tried to make her say the things he wants her to say, and she won't. Then she has this sexy scene with Lenny. She tells him she'd been modeling. It was down by a lake. Remember that we said nature is always very scary. Water in Pinter is never a good thing. And then we switch the light switch on, which is the chandelier in the middle of the room. And Teddy says, what have you been saying, dear? He says to his brother. He gives Ruth her coat. He says, here's your coat. Ruth, come on, put it on. We're going. And Lenny says, what about one dance before you go? Teddy says, we're going. Just one. No, we're going. Just one dance with her brother-in-law. So this primal fight, the mythic fight between the brothers for territory, which is the woman, begins. And they start to dance. Next thing you know, Ruth and Lenny are kissing right under the light source in this iconic out of time way. And what does Teddy do? He stares. He doesn't know what, he can't control it. It's like libido and sex and the truth just happen. Joey walks in and says, Christ, she's wide open, Dad. Look at that. She's a tart. Old Lenny's got a tart in here, just up my street. He lies on top of her and starts to kiss her. Lenny sits and watches. And then if you don't think this is funny, then you just don't get Pinter. Max comes in. He looks at the two of them, his son rolling on top of Ruth, and he says, you going, Teddy? Already? When are you coming over again? Look, next time you come over, don't forget to let us know beforehand whether you're married or not. I'll always be glad to meet the wife. Honest, I'm telling you, while the wife is fucking your son on the floor. So, I mean, that's just Pinter comedy. I guess you kind of either love that or you don't. And then Ruth shows her hand. She asks for a whiskey. She wants food. And she sits in that powerful chair. The guys decide that they are going to keep her. And the reason Lenny wants to keep her is he knows now, in the most visceral way, that Teddy is out to destroy his family. How does he know? Again, one of the funniest scenes in Pinter, because Teddy has eaten his cheese roll. So again, in terms of territory, in terms of the way Pinter, without making it abstract, takes something as banal as a cheese roll, and the fight over a cheese roll tells us that there is no love lost between those brothers anymore, and that Teddy is out to destroy his family. Lenny says, you took my cheese roll? And Teddy says, yes, I made that roll myself. He goes on and on and on, Lenny. And Teddy says, well, what are you going to do about it? Lenny says, I'm waiting for you to apologize. And Teddy says, but I took it deliberately, Lenny. You mean you didn't stumble on it by mistake? No, I saw you put it there. I was hungry, so I ate it. So now the gloves are off. And this is what I mean about how you do these plays. You have to keep the tension so tight that by the time this scene happens and the gloves are off about the cheese roll, you think, what's going to happen now with Ruth? Joey comes down the stairs. Ruth has been upstairs. It turns out Ruth has held out on him and he hasn't even gone the whole hog. And he says, which is so touching, this poor boy who's looking for a mother, they're shocked and says, are you telling me she's a tease? Blah, 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 and all this stuff. And he's appalled. And Joey says, I've been the whole hog plenty of times. Sometimes you can be happy and not go the whole hog. Now and again, you can be happy without going any hog. He's found his mother, whatever that means. For a moment, there's something better than sex to Joey, which is he's met a woman who he feels seen by and loved by, and that's enough for him. So they decide that they want to keep her. And you think, and Max says, you mean put her on the game? We'll put her on the game. That's a stroke of genius. Remember I talked about Pinter in the game. Everything is a game. When Mick comes in and the caretaker and looks at, his brother with Davies, he looks at Davies and he grabs his arm and he says, what's the game? It's always a game, but these games are real. And they decide they're going to keep her and that they're going to send her down to Greek Street. And in the last moments, she negotiates. She says, how many rooms would that flat have? Not many. I would want at least 3 rooms and a bathroom. You wouldn't need 3 rooms and a bathroom. Max says she'd need a bathroom, but not 3 rooms. And Ruth says calmly, oh, I would really. 2 would do. No, 2 wouldn't be enough. I'd want a dressing room, a restroom, and a bedroom. So they have to agree. And then she says, what kind of conveniences? And, and then she says, you would have to regard your original outlay simply as a capital investment, meaning you're going to have to pay for all of this, and then we'll see whether I ever make you any money. And you'd supply my wardrobe, and I'd want to drop an inventory of everything I would need, which would require your signature in the presence of witnesses. Lenny says, naturally, they just don't know what to make of it all. And Max and Sam finally breaks the cardinal rule, which is never tell the truth straight out, and says, McGregor had Jesse in the back of my cab as I drove them along. And then he drops down onto the ground. You think he's dead, which he isn't. So everything, the whole house of cards is coming down. And again, brilliant comic timing. Teddy looks at that corpse on the ground and says, I was going to ask him to drive me to Luton Airport. I mean, it's like a stand-up comedy, right? And then he decides he's going to leave. So he says, well, I'll leave your case, Ruth. I'll go up the road. And Max says, thanks. Listen, I want to tell you something. It's been wonderful to see you, he says to Teddy. And Teddy says, it's been wonderful to see you. And Max says, do you boys know about me? And again, Matt is asking, do Ruth and Teddy really have children? Do we know? Hard to tell. I mean, is this a fabrication? Is Ruth really a mother? Is she the reincarnation of Jessie, who had 3 sons, and she has 3 sons? She certainly doesn't seem worried about those children. What kind of mother is this? Is it a theme of the abandonment that boys always get abandoned by their children, by their mother? You never know. Lenny says, ta-ta, Ted, good to see you. Have a good trip, as if it's been the best visit ever. Bye-bye, Joey. Ta-ta. And then Ruth says, and again, just brilliant Pinter use of naming. She says, Eddie. And he turns, and there's a pause. What is she going to say? Is she going to apologize? She says, don't become a stranger. Now, that could be a total cliche. You know, we say that to people all the time. Don't be a stranger. Call me up. Don't become a stranger, she says to him. And she lets him go. And the last image is of her sitting on this chair. And Max has a sort of mini stroke. He starts to realize that all the negotiations in the world, she's not going to capitulate. And he says, Lenny, do you think she understands what we're getting at? What we've got in mind? Do you think she's got it clear? I don't think she's got it clear. You understand what I mean? Listen, I got a funny idea. She'll do the dirty on us. Do you want to bet? She'll use us. She'll make use of us. I can tell you, I can smell it. You want to bet? She won't be adaptable. Then he falls to his knees. He starts to whimper. He sort of sobs. Sam's body is just lying on the ground. Joey is sitting with his head in Ruth's lap. Ruth is stroking his hair. And he says to her, I'm not an old man. Kiss me. And that's the end. Now, so I feel in some surreal way, it is the triumph of Ruth. And I have to believe that Pinter felt this way. A lot of people don't. A lot of the original criticism and even recent criticism think it's a misogynistic play. I think you cannot define as sexist a play that creates a woman who is so three-dimensional and in control of her own destiny. You may not like Ruth or believe anything she says. We don't know if the stories of her past are true, but what we see is her behavior, right? If in a patriarchal world, men are going to try to control women and dominate their bodies and determine how and when they have sex, then the woman's only chance is to negotiate the best deal she can get. And that's kind of what Pinter's saying. Not that it's a good thing or a bad thing, or that anybody really wins, but that given the landscape of the world in which women are endlessly second-class citizens, this is the only choice and the best choice that Ruth could make. And that in a way, what this homecoming permits of Ruth is to get away from an absolutely dead and deathly marriage. And as she describes her life in America, you feel like she's been dead. She's been stripped of agency. And maybe she has 3 children, but maybe she's not a woman who finds satisfaction in children. There are such women. And maybe she loved London, or she loved her job, or she loved whatever. Like Vivian Merchant loved acting and eventually sort of went mad because she couldn't compete with Pinter, and she didn't want to be a mother. I mean, Vivian Merchant didn't really want Daniel, and Daniel turned out to be a very estranged and unhappy human being. It's a very sad story, Pinter and Vivian. And when they split, when they divorced, it was a kind of awful disintegration of a relationship that had been built off an artistic synergy that then never sort of sustained. So I think Pinter really felt for Ruth, but I think he feels for all of them. And here's one last thing I will say. In the first French production, which Pinter went to see, he told me this story. He was incredibly upset that the tableau he'd written in the end was not honored, because in the last image of the play, and again, you have to trust Pinter and go with his stage directions, it says, Max falls to his knees, whimpers, begin to moan and sob. He stops sobbing, crawls past Sam's body, round the chair to the other side of Ruth. I'm not an old man. He looks up at her. Do you hear me? He raises his face to her. Kiss me. And then it says she continues to touch Joey's head lightly. So just lightly. And it says Lenny stands watching. In the French production, Lenny had his arms on Ruth. And Pinter said, his hands on Ruth's shoulders. And Pinter said, why did you do that? It's wrong. And the actress playing Ruth said, well, because he's my pimp, right? And Pinter said, no, he's watching. He's watching. He is not controlling you at the end of the play. He is standing on the outside watching. So this is what I mean. You have to try, because there's never anything random in Pinter. You really do have to try and follow the nuance of those stage directions and figure out, what does it tell you about the inner life of these characters? He leaves you very free to make decisions about their inner life. So for instance, Matt's question, did Ruth and Teddy really have children? Pinter doesn't answer that. He doesn't answer whether Stanley's Jewish and whether he really was an artist. He doesn't answer, things about Davies. Susan's asking, did the movie follow the stage directions? No. That's why I'm really hesitant to have you watch the movie. It's not their fault, but you can't do it in a movie. In the movie, a camera closes in, but it doesn't hold the frame of the room. Ruth goes out of the room. She goes into the street, just as they did in The Caretaker. She looks at the window. She comes back. They do all kinds of different things. They do this weird thing where the top of Act 2 would be that they're all sitting around the table eating the meal, but it's so much better that we don't see the meal and we don't see them together eating. All we see of the end of the meal is the cigars, as if a baby's been born, and Ruth's coffee. So Ruth kind of has taken over the meal. So it's not their fault. You can't. In a movie, it's much more naturalistic. There's nothing you can do, but it's why I just never feel that with Pinter, film is really the right way to experience the work. I would always say to you, far better to go see it or read it out loud to yourself. So that's the kind of framing of, will I teach a one-act playwriting class? What do you mean a one-act playwriting class? Mary Grace, I'm not quite sure what you mean. I'd be happy to do it if I understood. Debbie's saying the children, when we first see Ruth and Teddy, she's concerned that if they stay away, the children are going to miss them. Are we to disregard that? A bit later. Very good, close reading, Debbie. Teddy talks about what the children are doing at the US. One-act play at that hour. So that's a super good question, Debbie. So the question is, and the actor has to decide, when Ruth first says, the children will be missing us, right? Maybe we should go now. What is that? That's her tactic to upend Teddy's homecoming and control how long they're going to stay. Later, when he says, shall we stay? And she says, well, yeah, we've just come, basically. And he says, I think it's time for us to go. Teddy's decision, because the men are getting far too fond of Ruth, and because he's terrified that his brothers are going to find out Ruth's secret, he wants to get her out of there. He says the children would be doing this now or that now. Now, my personal feeling is, I think they do have 3 children. I think that these are all just my theories, and they're not based on anything. It was just things to play. Actors always have their own secrets. When we did it, I imagined that Lenny and Ruth had a sexual relationship. I imagined that she was pregnant when she met Teddy, that she met Teddy because they were brothers, that she married him, and probably their first child isn't necessarily his, that there's an ongoing question about paternity, which is why he's so controlling of her. It's possible. There are hints of that in the play. And I think that she's been an unhappy mother. And I think that this homecoming is her way of escaping from all of that and going back on the game in her own terms. you know, or at least going back to the country that she felt seen and where she could buy the right shoes and where she felt heard. And Teddy goes back the way that Max is left with his three sons. He's going to be left with his, and soon he's going to be making up stories about their mother. And it goes on like that. So those things, I would say, in Pinter, you have the delicious opportunity to invent past story, because the thing that is so true to life about Pinter is he understands that we all manipulate our past in order to control the present. Do you know what I mean? Over and over and over again, I think about looking at the Biden family and you know, what a complete ne'er-do-well Hunter Biden is. And the excuses of that family are to go back to the past, valorize Beau, and say that all of Hunter's problems started when his brother got sick. That may be true, but it also may be the narrative a family, a political public family, needs to tell itself in order to justify the terrible behavior of one of their children. We'll never know the truth. The family might not even know the truth. And that's what Pinter understands, that the past is only a weapon towards the future. So next week, we're going to read Old Times, in which the past is really a weapon, and in which a marriage is disintegrating because the wife has a past that terrifies the husband. It's Pinter's most blatantly homoerotic play. It may be a lesbian play. It's hard to be sure. We did it at ACT in about, I can't remember, 1998 or 9, with Pamela Reed and Michelle Moraine and Graham Beckel. So I'll show you a few images of that. But I'm very curious what you'll make of it, because it's a real female play. It has, and again, that's again, unlike Mamet, it has two extraordinary women and a very funny man named Dealey. Okay, thank you for all of your questions. I hope I got to most of them as we were going along, but as always, feel free to hold them in your mind. And what is that play? The one I just mentioned, it's called Old Times. And again, you can get a copy of it anywhere. I don't think you're going to find this one filmed. I went and looked all over the place, but you guys are better at this than I am often, so you may find it. There are short YouTubes of productions. In fact, if you want to see a very weirdly designed production that did not work in 2010 in New York, with Clive Owen in the lead, you can Google that one at the Roundabout from 2010 and find out. Yeah, Mary Lou, you wanted to ask something? Your hand is raised.
I just asked you if you can unmute yourself, Mr. Barden.
Hi, now, Carrie, I just want, this is a excellent. We watched.
Wait, I'm hearing two people at once. So who am I listening to first?
I'm Dennis. Instead of Mary.
Hi.
We watched the production by Peter Hall, and I can understand what you're talking about. You're looking at the stage, but quite frankly, I thought it was brilliant. I thought,
oh, good. Well, I'm glad that was useful. Yay.
We'd read the play, but it was so much more interesting to see the actors. And I must say that the way Teddy was played, very detached, calm,
isn't that scary?
Very scary, and quite frankly, I agree with you. I think that Ruth rules the roost at the end like a modern Ishtar. But Teddy, I think, was happy to get rid of her. He was happy. He was very content to just let her stay there and leave and get her out of his life. The way he played was very detached and cool, and I didn't think he was upset at all by having her stay there.
Well, if it's a choice between controlling your own destiny or giving over to somebody else's control, Teddy's going to choose control. Absolutely, 100%. Was there one more question that I didn't get?
No,
Mary?
I think that may have been me that I was talking, but I think, yeah, so it was just Dennis Bryden that had his hand up.
Oh, okay, great. All right, team, I think we're slightly at our time. So unless there's anything you are longing to know, I'm happy to stay on if there's anything you responded to, but otherwise, I will see you next week for Old Times. And what I'm hoping in a couple of weeks is I'm going to get a couple of actors who've been in some of these plays to come on with us as guests just to talk to you about acting in Pinter. But if there's anything else particular that you think we're not really hitting or people you'd love to hear from, I'm happy to include that. So let me know. Okay.
Thanks, Professor, and thank you, students, for joining us. We'll see you all.
Thank you, everybody.